Everyone treats The Simpsons as a harmless cartoon, something that pokes fun at Springfield and nothing more. People assume Fox just handed the writers cartoon jokes to fill airtime, but Rupert Murdoch himself once agreed to call his own company something far darker on screen. This is Simpsons vs. Big Corporations. Mr. Burns, the blueprint for every evil corporation on TV. The Simpsons first aired as a full episode on December 17, 1989, with a Christmas special called Simpsons Roasting on an Open Fire. Before Bart ever skated through Springfield or Homer ever choked on a donut, the show introduced Charles Montgomery Burns, the owner of the Springfield Nuclear Power Plant and Homer's boss. In that very first episode, Burns cancels the yearly Christmas bonus for every worker at his plant, forcing Homer to scramble for money to buy presents for his family. That single choice, made in the show's opening hour, set the pattern for one of television's longest-running corporate villains. Nearly every trait that would define Burns for the next several decades was already present in that first appearance. He was rich beyond reason, careless about the people who worked for him, and completely unbothered by the pain his decisions caused. Burns is voiced by Harry Shearer, who has played the character since the show began. Shearer gives Burns a thin, raspy, almost ancient-sounding voice that fits a man who has been rich for so long that ordinary human concerns barely register with him. Burns is drawn as extremely old and extremely frail, with a hunched back and bony hands, yet he runs one of the most powerful businesses in Springfield without any real challenge to his authority. His frailty is part of the joke. He looks like he could barely lift a teacup, but he holds enough power to control the electricity, the jobs, and often the local government of an entire town. The show never explains exactly how old he is, but he is treated as impossibly ancient, someone who has outlived entire generations of Springfield residents while his fortune only grows. Burns was born into money. The show has returned again and again to the idea that his wealth did not come from hard work or clever ideas, but from being born into a family that already had more money than most people could imagine. He was sent away as a small child to be raised apart from his parents, growing up isolated in luxury instead of with warmth or affection. This detail becomes important in later episodes, but even before viewers learn the specifics of his childhood, the show makes clear that Burns sees money as something he is entitled to, not something he had to earn. He treats his workers, his neighbors, and even his own family as tools to be used for his benefit, and he rarely apologizes for it because, in his mind, there is nothing to apologize for. The plant itself is central to who Burns is. The Springfield Nuclear Power Plant supplies electricity to the town, and Burns runs it with almost no attention to safety. Throughout the show, background jokes reveal barrels of glowing waste sitting in open fields, safety inspections that get bribed away, and a general sense that the plant is one bad day away from disaster. The three-eyed fish named Blinky, first seen swimming near the plant's water outflow, becomes one of the show's most famous recurring jokes, precisely because it ties Burns directly to environmental damage that never gets fixed. Homer works as a safety inspector at this same plant, which makes the joke even sharper. The man responsible for keeping the plant safe is lazy and easily distracted, and the man who owns the plant does not care whether it is safe at all, as long as it keeps making money. One of the clearest early examples of Burns using his money to cover up harm to the public comes from the Season 2 episode called 2 Cars in Every Garage and 3 Eyes on Every Fish. In this episode, Burns decides to run for governor of the state, going up against the sitting governor, Mary Bailey. His campaign runs into trouble when Blinky, the three-eyed fish, is discovered near the power plant and becomes public proof that the plant has been polluting the water supply. Instead of admitting the problem, Burns tries to control the story. He invites television reporters and a health inspector to a fancy dinner at his mansion, planning to serve them normal fish while claiming that mutated fish like Blinky are perfectly safe and even a sign of evolution. The plan falls apart when Burns himself ends up served the actual three-eyed fish on live television. He is forced to eat it in front of cameras, and his disgusted, almost inhuman reaction is broadcast to every voter in the state. He loses the election immediately after, not because voters found new information, intention, but because they watched his mask slip for a few seconds on live television. The episode captures something the show would repeat for years afterward: the idea that Burns is not undone by getting caught doing something wrong, but by accidentally showing his true feelings in public. A few seasons later, the show gave Burns one of his most famous storylines in Last Exit to Springfield, an episode widely considered one of the best in the series. Burns decides the plant needs to cut costs, and he chooses to remove the workers' dental plan to help pay for other plans of his own. This decision accidentally turns Homer, who normally has no interest in leadership or politics, into the head of the plant's labor union, mostly because Homer happens to be in the right place at the right time and cares about the dental plan only because his daughter Lisa needs braces. What follows is a standoff between Burns and his own employees, complete with a strike, picket signs, and Burns trying every trick he can think of to break the workers' will, including hiring replacement labor and even threatening to bring in robots to do the workers' jobs instead. In the end, Burns backs down, not because he suddenly develops sympathy for his employees, but because he mistakenly believes Homer has uncovered a secret that could destroy him financially. The dental plan is restored, the strike ends, and Burns walks away having lost this particular fight only by accident. The episode remains one of the show's most direct examples of a company trying to strip basic benefits from its workers to protect the profits of the man at the top. Burns' willingness to put profit ahead of public safety reached its most extreme point in the two-part episode Who Shot Mr. Burns, which closed out Season 6 and opened Season 7 in 1995. In this story, Burns discovers that Springfield Elementary School is sitting on top of a large pool of oil. Instead of leaving the school alone, he begins drilling for the oil directly underneath the building, draining resources the school and the town depend on. As if that were not enough, Burns also constructs a giant device capable of blocking out the sun over Springfield entirely. A machine built for one simple reason: to force the entire town to rely on his power plant for light and heat, since natural sunlight would no longer be available. The blackout device angers nearly everyone in town at once, giving almost every character a reason to want Burns gone. When Burns is shot and left for dead, the show spends the following episode working through a long list of suspects, each one revealed to have their own personal grudge against him, built from years of being cheated, ignored, or harmed by his decisions. The eventual reveal that baby Maggie Simpson pulled the trigger by accident while reaching for a lollipop works as a punchline specifically because almost anyone else in town would have made just as much sense as the shooter. Burns had spent years creating enemies without ever noticing or caring, and the show used an entire storyline to make that point unmistakably clear. Burns has also tried more than once to control how the public sees him, not through changing his behavior, but through public relations tricks meant to hide it. In the 1995 crossover episode, A Star is Burns, made together with the short-lived animated show The Critic, Springfield holds a film festival, and Burns enters a short film of his own, funded entirely to fix his public image. The film is designed to look like an inspiring, big-budget movie, closely modeled on the style of Schindler's List, a film about a real businessman who saved lives during a genuine historical tragedy. Burns wants that same sense of noble sacrifice attached to his own name, despite having done nothing to deserve it. Jay Sherman, the film critic character from The Critic, is brought in to judge the festival, and after facing pressure and bribery from Burns, initially praises the film before the truth about its purpose comes out. The episode makes its point clearly. Burns does not want to become a better person. He wants a movie that makes people believe he already is one, and he is willing to spend heavily to make that happen. Even Burns' more personal moments tend to circle back to money and control. In the Season 5 episode Rosebud, Burns turns 100 years old and becomes fixated on finding a stuffed teddy bear named Bobo that he lost as a small child, sent away from his family at a very young age, and raised with wealth instead of warmth. The episode borrows its structure from the classic film Citizen Kane, where a powerful, lonely man spends his final years chasing after a symbol of the one part of his childhood that felt real. Burns eventually discovers that Bobo has ended up with a homeless man in Springfield, someone Burns had once known and mistreated decades earlier. Rather than reconnecting with this person or making amends, Burns simply tries to buy the bear back, offering large sums of money, as though that alone should be enough to fix what was broken. The episode gives Burns a rare moment of humanity, hinting at where his coldness may have come from, without ever excusing the way he treats people because of it. That pattern, using money to fix problems that money cannot actually fix, shows up again in the Season 5 episode, Burns' Heir. Burns becomes convinced that he is dying and decides he needs to find someone to inherit his fortune, since he has no children of his own. After testing several children in town, he settles on Bart, moving him into the mansion and treating him almost like a son for a short time. The arrangement falls apart, and Burns eventually reveals that his terminal illness was never real to begin with, and the entire search for an heir had been a manufactured stunt from the start, built for his own financial benefit rather than any real concern about who might inherit his estate. Once again, Burns treats deeply personal matters, in this case the idea of family and inheritance, purely as tools to serve his own interests, discarding them the moment they stop being useful. Even when Burns actually loses everything, the show finds a way to show that his instincts never change. In the Season 8 episode, The Old Man and the Lisa, Burns loses his entire fortune after a public backlash turns against him. Rather than staying down, he turns to Lisa Simpson for help rebuilding his wealth, and together they start a recycling business that takes Springfield's garbage and turns it into a cheap food substitute sold to the public. The business becomes a success, and Burns regains his fortune almost overnight. However, once the money starts flowing back in, Burns immediately goes back on his promise to share the profits with Lisa, the same person who helped him recover in the first place. The episode makes clear that losing everything did not teach Burns anything about fairness or gratitude. The moment his fortune returned, so did his old habits. Across all of these stories, spread out over more than 3 decades of episodes, Burns never really changes. He does not learn from the strike at his plant, from losing the governor's race, from being exposed as a fraud, from nearly dying, or from getting help when he needed it most. Each episode resets him back to the same starting point, a wealthy, indifferent old man who sees people mostly in terms of what they can do for him. That refusal to grow is exactly what makes him useful as a symbol. He was never meant to represent one bad business owner having a bad year. He was built to represent the idea of unchecked power itself, the kind of person who keeps their position no matter how many mistakes come out, because the system around them is built to protect people like him rather than punish them. By the time later decades of television started filling their own shows with cold, wealthy villains running companies without a conscience, Burns had already been doing it for years. Long before prestige dramas built entire seasons around powerful men protecting their fortunes at any cost, an animated cartoon had already quietly laid out the same idea, using a frail old man in a business suit who could end a person's career with a single word and rarely thought twice about doing it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Burns represents the power that comes from owning something enormous, a plant, a fortune, an entire town's electricity supply. The next section moves away from a single owner and towards something bigger, a chain of stores spread across Springfield that shapes how people shop, what they buy, and how little choice they end up having in the matter, without a single named villain standing behind the counter. Section 2. Sprawl Mart and the retail giant Springfield can't quit. Long before people started using the term big box store as an everyday phrase, The Simpsons had already given Springfield its own version of one. The store is called Sprawl Mart, and it shows up again and again across the show's history as the town's stand-in for a massive, low-price retail chain that sells everything from groceries to electronics to lawn furniture under one giant roof. The name itself is the joke. Sprawl Mart is built to sound almost exactly like Walmart, the real-world retail company that grew from a single store store into the largest retail chain in the United States, while also poking fun at the word sprawl, a term often used to describe how big stores and parking lots spread out and take over land on the edges of towns. Unlike Mr. Burns, who gives the show a single face to attach to corporate power, Sprawl Mart works differently. It has no owner shown on screen, no single villain standing behind a desk making decisions. It is simply there, a massive building that swallows up shopping trips, jobs, and even parts of the town's identity without needing a name attached to explain why it has so much power. Sprawl Mart first became a clear part of the show's world in the early 2000s, a period when large chain retailers were becoming a bigger part of everyday conversation across the country. Around this same time, real-world debates were heating up about what happens to small towns when a massive retail chain moves in nearby. Local hardware stores, family-owned grocery shops, and small clothing stores often struggled to compete with a chain that could sell the same products for less money simply because it bought in bulk and operated on a much larger scale. Sprawl Mart takes that real-world pattern and turns it into a backdrop for Springfield, a store so large and so cheap that nobody in town seems able to resist shopping there, even when they complain about it. One of the clearest examples of Sprawl Mart appearing on screen comes from the episode The Fat and the Furriest, which aired in 2003. In this episode, Homer goes to Sprawl Mart to buy Marge a gift for Mother's Day. What he picks out is a large kitchen machine called a kitchen carnival, a single appliance built to do far too many things at once, including making cotton candy, holding a vat of liquid caramel, and deep frying food, all built into one clunky machine. The purchase itself works as a joke about the kind of products a massive retail store tends to push toward shoppers: oversized, over-engineered items that promise convenience but often end up being impractical. Homer eventually uses the machine to create a giant ball of deep-fried, caramel-covered cotton candy, and once it becomes too dirty and inedible to use anymore, Marge tells him to get rid of it entirely. The gift, bought cheaply and in a hurry from a massive store with endless aisles of choices, ends up being nearly useless within the same episode. The same episode also shows a very different side of Sprawl Mart through a subplot involving Nelson Muntz, one of the show's recurring bully characters. In this storyline, Nelson tries to shoplift items from the store, and after getting caught with his arms restrained, he finds a way around the problem by sucking products directly into his mouth instead of using his hands. It is a small, strange gag built purely for a laugh, but it also quietly points to something real about large retail stores. Because Sprawl Mart carries so many products across such a huge space, it becomes an easy target for theft, precisely because no single employee can watch every aisle at once. The store's size, the same size that lets it offer so many products at low prices, is also what makes it harder to control what happens inside its own walls. Sprawl Mart's presence in the show goes beyond individual jokes about shoplifting or bad kitchen appliances. Its name and design point to a larger pattern that real-world writers and researchers have studied for years. A pattern where The Simpsons takes real brands and real companies and slightly renames them, just enough to avoid using the actual company name, while still making it completely clear who is being talked about. Academic writing on the show has pointed directly to Sprawl Mart as one of the clearest examples of this technique, describing it as a direct stand-in for Walmart, built specifically to let the show comment on real consumer culture without using the real brand name. This kind of parody, sometimes called culture jamming by people who study media, takes something familiar from everyday life and twists it slightly, using humor and exaggeration to make a point that a straightforward news report might not land as effectively. Sprawl Mart's design in the show reflects real facts about how large retail stores like Walmart actually grew and operated in the real world. Walmart began as a single store opened by Sam Walton in Rogers, Arkansas in 1962. Over the following decades, the company expanded rapidly across the country, eventually growing into the largest retail chain in the United States and one of the largest private employers in the country. Its business model relied heavily on selling large volumes of goods at low prices, buying directly from manufacturers in bulk, and building enormous stores that could carry thousands of different products under one roof. This model allowed Walmart to offer lower prices than many smaller smaller competing stores, since the company's massive buying power let it negotiate cheaper costs from suppliers than a small, independently owned shop ever could. Sprawl Mart mirrors this same basic setup inside Springfield, a store so large and so cheap that it becomes nearly impossible for smaller businesses in town to compete with it directly. This same real-world pattern, large retail chains moving into small towns and changing how people shop, became a major talking point across the country during the years The Simpsons was airing many of its Sprawl Mart appearances. Communities across the United States debated whether a new large retail store moving into town was a benefit or a threat. Supporters pointed to lower prices and more job openings. Critics pointed to smaller stores closing down because they could not match the prices offered by a chain that operated on a much bigger scale. Sprawl Mart, without ever explaining any of this directly, uses its presence in Springfield to quietly reflect that same tension. The store is never shown forcing anyone to shop there. It does not need to. Its low prices and huge selection make it the obvious choice for most of Springfield's residents, even when those same residents complain about how it has changed their town. Unlike a character such as Mr. Burns, who can be blamed personally for firing an employee or cutting a benefit, Sprawl Mart represents something harder to point a finger at directly. Nobody in Springfield seems to hate Sprawl Mart the way they might hate a specific person who wronged them. Instead, the store simply exists as part of daily life, something residents rely on constantly, without much thought given to what shopping there might be costing the town in other ways. This mirrors how many real communities have described the arrival of major retail chains, not as a dramatic villain moving in overnight, but as a slow, steady shift in where people spend their money and time, one that becomes normal so quickly that its effects are barely noticed until much later. The show has also used Sprawl Mart to poke fun at the sheer size and strangeness of what a massive retail store chooses to stock on its shelves. Large chain stores, in real life and inside the show, often carry an enormous range of products that have very little to do with each other. Groceries next to electronics, clothing next to gardening tools, all crammed into a single building far larger than any traditional shop could ever be. This kind of setup is part of what allows companies like Walmart to keep prices low, since customers can buy nearly everything they need in one single trip, reducing the need to visit several smaller specialty stores. Sprawl Mart follows this same pattern in Springfield, appearing at different points in the show selling appliances, toys, seasonal decorations, and general household goods, always presented as the default place Springfield residents go when they need something quickly and cheaply. Even the name Sprawl Mart carries a second layer of meaning beyond simply mocking Walmart's actual name. The word sprawl, especially in conversations about towns and cities, usually refers to the way development spreads outward, often eating up farmland, open space, or smaller neighborhoods to make room for large parking lots and massive buildings. Big box retail stores in real life have often been built on the edges of towns, surrounded by huge parking lots designed to handle large crowds of cars. Critics of this kind of development have argued for years that this pattern pulls shoppers and money away from older town centers, leaving formerly busy main streets quieter and more empty as people choose to drive to the large store instead of walking downtown. Sprawl Mart's name quietly nods to this same criticism, folding a real complaint about how towns physically change into a joke about a fictional retail chain's name. The show never turns Sprawl Mart into the center of a full episode plot, the way it does with Mr. Burns or the power plant. Instead, it works more like scenery, a store that quietly shapes the choices Springfield's residents make without ever becoming the main focus of the story. This approach fits with how many real people actually experience shopping at a massive retail chain. Few people spend much time thinking deeply about the company behind the store while they are simply trying to buy groceries or find a birthday present. Sprawl Mart captures that same casual background presence, showing up in the middle of ordinary errands rather than dramatic confrontations, which in some ways makes its message even sharper. The show is not asking Springfield's residents to have some big realization about the store. It is simply showing how normal and unquestioned shopping there has become, woven into daily life the same way it has become woven into daily life across much of the real world. world. Because Sprawl Mart appears without a single owner or spokesperson attached to it, the show is able to use it differently than characters like Mr. Burns. Burns lets the show point directly at one person and blame him for greed, carelessness, or cruelty. Sprawl Mart, on the other hand, lets the show comment on a system, a pattern of shopping and spending that affects nearly the entire town at once, without needing to invent a single villain to stand in for it. This gives the show two very different tools for talking about big business. One tool is a face people can point at and dislike directly. The other is a building, a name, and a shopping habit that everyone quietly takes part in, whether they think about it or not. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Sprawl Mart's low, steady presence throughout the show's history stands in sharp contrast to the next kind of corporate takeover Springfield experiences, one that does not simply sell products to the town, but actually buys a piece of it outright, walking straight into the one place most people assume a company could never reach. Section 3. Kid First Industries. When a toy company buys the school. Grift of the Magi is the 9th episode of the 11th season of The Simpsons. It aired on December 19th, 1999, making it the final new episode of the show to air during the entire decade of the 1990s. The episode was written by Tom Martin and directed by Matthew Nastuck. It brought in several guest voices, including Tim Robbins as a businessman named Jim Hope, Joe Mantegna returning as the recurring mob boss character Fat Tony, and Gary Coleman appearing as himself. The story is built around Christmas, toy shopping, and a school that ends up owned by a company for the first time in the show's history, and it remains one of the clearest examples of the show imagining what happens when a business gains direct control over a place that is supposed to serve children rather than sell to them. The episode begins with a very different kind of threat to Springfield Elementary School than anything the students or teachers are used to facing. Fat Tony, the local organized crime boss, voiced by Joe Mantegna since his first appearance earlier in the show's run, successfully extorts a large sum of money from the school. This puts Principal Skinner in an impossible position. Without the money that has been taken from the school, there is no way to keep it running, and Skinner is forced to shut Springfield Elementary down completely. For a show that has spent years using the school as one of its main settings, closing it down, even temporarily, is a significant plot turn, one that clears the way for something new to take its place. That something new arrives in the form of Kid First Industries, a toy company led by a businessman named Jim Hope, voiced by Tim Robbins. Rather than letting the school reopen under the town's usual local control, Kid First Industries buys the school outright and takes it over as private property. This detail matters because it changes the basic relationship between the school and the people running it. A public school in Springfield, like public schools in most towns, is normally paid for and overseen by local government and taxpayers, existing to educate children rather than to make a profit. Once Kid First Industries owns the building, that arrangement flips completely. The school now exists because a toy company decided it was a good business opportunity, and every decision made inside its walls becomes a decision made with the company's own interests in mind first. Once Kid First Industries takes control, the classes at Springfield Elementary shift almost entirely toward toys and marketing. Instead of traditional subjects like math, reading, or science taking center stage, the school day becomes built around figuring out what children want, since that information is directly useful to a toy company trying to sell products. The show frames this shift as something the students barely question, since kids are naturally used to trusting the adults running their school, without necessarily realizing that this particular set of adults is far more interested in what sells during the holiday season than in teaching them anything lasting. This setup lets the episode make a very direct point without needing to explain it through dialogue. A school that answers to a business instead of to families and educators will naturally start acting like a business, even in a building filled with children too young to fully understand what has changed around them. The company's plan comes together just in time for the holiday shopping season, when Kid First Industries releases a brand new toy called Funzo. Funzo is designed specifically to match what the students at the newly acquired school say they want, since the company has direct access to their opinions and reactions through the classroom itself. This detail turns the school into something something closer to a research lab for the toy industry than a place of learning, with children unknowingly providing free feedback that helps a company build a product designed to sell as widely as possible. Funzo becomes an aggressive, over-the-top toy, one built not just to be popular on its own, but specifically designed to physically destroy competing toys, wiping out any rival products a child might already own or want instead. The idea of a single toy becoming a massive holiday obsession, with children and parents scrambling to get their hands on it before Christmas, is not something the show invented purely for comedy. Real toy crazes have happened many times throughout recent decades, where a single product becomes so popular during the holiday season that stores struggle to keep it in stock, and parents end up competing with each other to secure one before the holidays arrive. Toys like Cabbage Patch Kids in the early 1980s and Tickle Me Elmo in the mid-1990s both became famous examples of this kind of frenzy, with demand for a single toy spiking so quickly that supply could not keep up, leading to long lines, high resale prices, and even physical confrontations between shoppers trying to grab the last ones off the shelves. Funzo, arriving in a 1999 episode built specifically around Christmas shopping, taps directly into that same real-world pattern, showing how a toy company might try to manufacture that same kind of demand on purpose, using direct access to children's opinions to build a product almost guaranteed to sell out. Bart and Lisa Simpson end up at the center of the episode's response to Funzo, since the two of them recognize how aggressive and destructive the toy has become. Rather than simply disliking Funzo the way a normal toy critic might, the two siblings decide to take action against it directly, working to destroy every Funzo toy that has been sold throughout Springfield. This puts two children, still students at the very school Kid First Industries now owns, in direct opposition to the company running their education. It is a detail that captures something important about how the episode frames corporate control over a school. The very students the company is supposedly serving end up becoming the ones actively working against its most profitable product, since they are close enough to see exactly how harmful and manipulative that product really is. The episode's guest voice cast adds another layer worth understanding on its own. Tim Robbins, an actor known for his work in serious dramatic films, voices Jim Hope, giving the character of a toy company executive a certain calm, reasonable-sounding voice, rather than making him sound like an obvious cartoon villain. This choice fits a pattern the show often uses when portraying business figures who cause harm without necessarily seeing themselves as bad people. Jim Hope is not written as someone twisting his hands together and laughing at the idea of hurting children. He is written as someone who genuinely believes he is providing a service, wrapped inside decisions that end up hurting the very students his company now controls. Joe Mantegna's return as Fat Tony connects the episode back to earlier appearances of the character, tying the story's starting point, extortion by organized crime, to its ending point, a private company taking control of what crime had broken. Gary Coleman appearing as himself adds a layer of real-world celebrity into the story, a common technique the show has used throughout its run to blend fictional plots with recognizable real names and faces. Grift of the Magi also plays with a very specific kind of humor about how far advertising and product design will go to appeal to children directly, especially around the holidays. Funzo's ability to destroy other toys works as an exaggerated joke, but it points towards something that has been discussed seriously in conversations about advertising aimed at children. Toy companies have long understood that children can be especially responsive to advertising, sometimes more so than adults, since they may not yet have developed the same skepticism toward advertising claims that adults tend to build up over time. A toy built specifically because a company gathered direct opinions from children inside their own school, then engineered a product almost guaranteed to dominate the market, pushes that real dynamic to its most extreme possible version, using comedy to highlight how easily children's honest reactions can be turned into a business strategy. The idea of a private company owning and running a public school also reflects a topic that has come up in real discussions about education for many years. Public schools are usually funded through taxes and overseen by local government boards, elected specifically to represent the interests of families and communities. Over the years, there have been ongoing debates in many places about how much private companies should be allowed to influence what happens inside public school classrooms, whether through sponsorship deals, branded products placed in cafeterias, textbooks funded by outside companies, or other forms of corporate involvement in education. Grift of the Magi takes that real debate and pushes it about as far as it can possibly go, imagining a version of a school that is not just influenced by a company on the side, but is fully owned and directly operated by one, with education itself reshaped entirely around what benefits that company's bottom line. Unlike Mr. Burns, who represents power built around one person's fortune, or Sprawl Mart, which represents a massive retail chain quietly shaping how a whole town shops, Kid First Industries represents something different again, a company reaching directly into a place that is normally protected from business interests entirely. Most people do not expect a toy company to ever be in a position to decide what gets taught inside an actual classroom. That expectation is exactly what the episode plays with. By starting the story with something as ordinary sounding as a school running out of money, then ending with an entire curriculum rebuilt around selling toys, the episode shows how quickly a place built around children's well-being can be reshaped once a business decides there is profit to be made from it. The episode's ending also fits a pattern the show often follows when dealing with corporate storylines. Kid First Industries does not get shut down through some kind of official investigation or public outcry from angry parents demanding change. Instead, the resolution comes through Bart and Lisa taking direct physical action against the company's most harmful product themselves, destroying Funzo toys across town rather than waiting for adults or institutions to step in and fix the problem. This choice reflects something the show returns to again and again throughout its history involving big business storylines. Officials, whether school boards, city government, or regulators, are rarely shown stepping in effectively to stop harm caused by a company. It usually falls to ordinary characters, sometimes even children, to notice the problem and act on it directly, since the systems that are supposed to catch these problems either move too slowly or are too closely tied to the company's own interests to respond in time. Grift of the Magi also sits inside a long tradition of Christmas episodes made by the show, going back to its very first full episode in 1989. Christmas episodes on The Simpsons have often used the holiday as a backdrop for stories about money, family, and the pressure to buy the right gifts at the right time. Grift of the Magi fits neatly into that same tradition while adding its own twist, using the holiday shopping season as the exact moment a toy company chooses to make its biggest move, buying a school not during a random quiet month, but specifically timed to take advantage of the highest demand period of the entire year for toy sales. This timing detail matters, since it shows the company's decision was never really about helping a school in trouble. It was about positioning itself perfectly to profit from Christmas shopping season, using the school purchase as a convenient way to gather the exact information needed to build a hit product before the holiday deadline arrived. The character of Funzo itself became memorable enough that some later discussions of the show still bring it up specifically as an example of the series poking fun at monopolistic business behavior. A toy designed not simply to be popular, but to actively eliminate competition by destroying rival products outright. This detail turns Funzo from a simple parody of a popular toy into a much sharper joke about business strategy in general. The idea that some companies are less interested in making the best product and more interested in making sure no other product can survive alongside their own. Applied to a children's toy sold through a school the company now owns, the joke lands with an extra edge, since it ties a fairly serious business concept directly to an environment built specifically around trust, safety, and childhood innocence. Grift of the Magi ultimately tells a story about how quickly an institution built around children can be reshaped once ownership shifts into the hands of a company chasing profit rather than public good. The school does not slowly drift toward becoming more commercial over time. It flips almost overnight, the moment ownership itself changes hands, showing how much power simply owning something can carry, regardless of what that place was originally originally built to do. It stands as one of the show's more direct examples of a business reaching somewhere most viewers would assume a company could never actually go, using a toy, a holiday season, and a group of children who trusted the adults running their school to make that point land. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next company to draw the show's attention would not need to buy an entire building or take over anyone's education to make its presence felt. It would simply need customers willing to line up outside its doors, waiting for products built around a name, a founder, and a level of brand loyalty that would turn an entire store into something closer to a religious experience than a shopping trip. Section 4. Maple, the show's Apple parody and its $1,200 phone bill. My Pods and Boomsticks is the 7th episode of the 20th season of The Simpsons. It first aired on November 30th, 2008, on the Fox network. The episode was written by Mark Wilmore and directed by Stephen Dean Moore, and it also featured actress Shorey Aghdashloo as a guest voice. The title itself is built as a play on words, borrowing its sound from the book and movie Bedknobs and Broomsticks, while swapping in references to two of the episode's biggest plot points, a music player called the My Pod, and a suspected weapon that becomes part of a separate storyline involving Bart's new friend, Bashir. While the episode carries more than one plot thread running at the same time, the storyline that matters most for looking at how the show handles big business is the one built entirely around a company called Maple, a technology business designed from top to bottom to mirror one of the most recognizable companies in the real world, Apple. Maple is introduced through a massive retail store inside the Springfield Mall, a space clearly built to resemble the real Apple Store, a chain of retail locations that Apple opened around the world to sell its products directly to customers, rather than only through other electronics retailers. Inside the Maple store, the show fills nearly every detail with a direct nod to something real. The company sells a music player called the My Pod, standing in for Apple's iPod, a portable device that let users store and play digital music, and which became one of the most widely owned electronic devices of the 2000s. Maple also sells a MyPhone, a clear stand-in for the iPhone, the smartphone Apple released in 2007, just 1 year before this episode aired, which combined a phone, an internet browser, and a music player into a single handheld device, and helped reshape how people used mobile phones going forward. The store even includes a MyCube, styled after Apple's real Power Mac G4 Cube, a compact desktop computer Apple sold in the early 2000s that was known more for its unusual, small cube-shaped design than for widespread popularity. Even the customer service area inside the Maple store gets its own parody treatment. Apple's real retail stores feature something called the Genius Bar, a customer service counter where trained employees, referred to by Apple as geniuses, help customers troubleshoot problems with their devices or arrange repairs. Inside Maple, this same setup appears as the Brainiac Bar, a name that keeps the same basic idea: employees positioned as unusually smart experts ready to solve any tech problem a customer might have, while swapping in a slightly different word to avoid using Apple's actual branding. The doors leading into both the Maple store and Maple's larger headquarters are given a small extra detail as well, designed to open with the same sound effect used for doors opening aboard the Starship Enterprise in the Star Trek franchise. A small touch that adds to the sense that Maple presents its technology as something almost futuristic, larger than an ordinary electronics store. At the center of Maple sits its founder, a character named Steve Mobs. The name itself barely disguises who he is meant to represent: Steve Jobs, the real co-founder and longtime leader of Apple, who had built the company into one of the most valuable and closely followed businesses in the world by the time this episode aired in 2008. Steve Mobs is given the title of founder and CIO of Maple, which the show plays as standing for Chief Imaginative Officer, a title clearly built to sound similar to a real corporate title, such as Chief Executive Officer, while adding a playful twist that fits Apple's real-world reputation for presenting itself as a company built around creativity and imagination rather than simply manufacturing electronics. Steve Mobs delivers announcements to Maple customers through video messages played displayed on large screens inside the store, a detail that closely mirrors how Steve Jobs was famous in real life for personally presenting new Apple products on stage at large public events, often treated by media outlets and Apple fans as major happenings worth watching closely. The episode's central Maple storyline begins when Lisa Simpson visits the Maple store with her family and quickly becomes drawn to the products on display. She is unable to afford any of the actual devices for sale, including a set of fake-feeling earbuds called My Phonies, priced at $40, despite being nothing more than an imitation product rather than a real functioning device. While looking around the store, Lisa runs into Krusty the Clown, who happens to already own a MyPod but is unhappy with it, complaining that its screen is too small to watch movies comfortably and that he dislikes the selection of music available through it. Rather than dealing with the return process himself, Krusty simply hands the MyPod over to Lisa, who becomes immediately delighted to own one, despite having just watched an adult complain about how disappointing the same device actually is to use. Just as Lisa is admiring her new MyPod, a voice comes over the store's speaker system announcing that Steve Jobs is about to deliver an important message to everyone present. Seeing an opportunity for mischief, Bart interrupts the broadcast and begins impersonating Jobs directly, using the store's own audio system against the company that owns it. In this fake announcement, Bart, pretending to be Jobs, insults the very customers standing in the store, calling them losers and mocking their loyalty to the brand. He claims that Maple's MyPhones, which sell to customers for $500 each, actually cost only $8 to manufacture, a detail meant to exaggerate the difference between what a company charges customers and what it may actually cost to produce a device. Bart's fake version of Jobs goes even further, claiming that profits from Maple get invested directly into Microsoft, one of Apple's most well-known real-world competitors in the technology industry, and adding an absurd visual joke where Jobs and Microsoft co-founder Bill Gates are shown kissing each other while sitting on top of a large pile of money. This entire sequence builds toward one of the episode's most direct references to Apple's real-world advertising history. As Bart's prank plays out, Comic Book Guy, a longtime resident of Springfield known for his obsessive devotion to pop culture and technology, becomes furious watching what appears to be Jobs insulting Maple's own loyal customers. In response, he charges toward the giant screen playing the fake announcement and smashes it apart using a sledgehammer. This scene is built as a direct visual parody of a real television commercial Apple aired in 1984, often simply referred to today as the 1984 ad. That real commercial, which ran during the broadcast of the Super Bowl that year, showed an athlete running through a gray, oppressive-looking crowd before throwing a sledgehammer into a massive screen displaying a controlling figure, an advertisement built as a reference to the book 1984 by George Orwell, which describes a fictional society controlled entirely by a single, all-seeing authority. Apple's real ad used this imagery to present its own products as a way to break free from that kind of control, positioning its computers as tools for individual creativity rather than conformity. The Simpsons flips this same imagery on its head. Instead of a customer symbolically freeing people from a controlling company, Comic Book Guy smashes the screen simply because he feels personally offended on behalf of a brand he loves, turning an ad originally built around rebellion into a joke about blind brand loyalty instead. Once the chaos from Bart's prank settles down, Lisa's storyline shifts toward the financial side of owning a Maple product. She becomes increasingly caught up in her new MyPod, using it heavily, and downloading a large amount of music through it without paying close attention to the cost of doing so. Eventually, she receives a bill for the device totaling $1,200, an amount far beyond anything she could reasonably pay. This detail in the episode plays off a real complaint that circulated among smartphone users in the years just before and after this episode aired, related to unexpectedly large phone bills, sometimes caused by data charges, roaming fees while traveling, or other charges buried inside lengthy phone contracts that many customers did not fully read or understand before signing. Some of these real bills stretched across dozens or even hundreds of pages, an issue that had been reported on by news news outlets discussing customer complaints about surprise charges from mobile companies. Lisa's $1,200 My Bill takes that same real-world frustration and applies it directly to a fictional music player, exaggerating the amount for comedic effect, while keeping the underlying idea completely familiar to anyone who has ever opened a phone bill and found a number far higher than expected. Unable to pay off the debt on her own, Lisa travels to Maple's headquarters to try to work out a solution directly with Steve Mobs. The location of Maple's headquarters adds another layer to the joke, since it is shown as an enormous underwater facility, reachable only by a submersible vehicle shaped like a giant USB flash drive, a small object real-world computer users would recognize instantly as a common tool for storing digital files. Once Lisa reaches Mobs directly, he listens to her situation with an outward show of sympathy, but quickly reveals where his real priorities lie. He tells Lisa that even though Maple's advertising posters display the phrase "think differently," a phrase built to closely resemble Apple's actual real-world advertising slogan, "Think Different," the company's true, unspoken motto is simply "no refunds." This line captures the entire joke behind Maple in a single sentence.
A company can build its public image around creativity, individuality, and inspiring language on a poster, while its actual internal priority remains protecting its own profits above anything else, regardless of how that language is used to attract customers in the first place. Rather than forgiving Lisa's debt or offering a reasonable payment plan, Mobs instead offers her a job at Maple as a way to work off what she owes. The job itself turns out to be far from glamorous. Lisa is dressed inside a large MyPod-shaped costume and placed on a street corner where she is required to hand out promotional pamphlets to passing strangers while repeating the company's slogan, telling people to think differently. This detail closes out the Maple storyline with a sharp contrast built right into the joke itself. A company that markets itself around originality and individual thinking
ends up putting a child in an oversized foam costume, standing on a street corner, repeating the exact same phrase over and over to strangers who barely glance her way. The very slogan meant to sound inspiring becomes, in practice, something closer to a scripted chant Lisa has no real choice but to repeat, since it is the only way she can pay off a debt she barely understood taking on in the first place. The choice to build an entire episode plot around Apple specifically, rather than some other technology company, fits with how large and recognizable Apple had become by 2008, the year this episode aired. Apple had been led by Steve Jobs since the company's founding in 1976, alongside co-founder Steve Wozniak, and had gone through periods of major struggle, including a stretch during the 1990s when the company nearly went out of business entirely. Jobs returned to lead Apple again in 1997, and over the following decade, the company released a series of products that reshaped how millions of people listened to music, browsed the internet, and used mobile phones, including the iPod in 2001 and the iPhone in 2007. By the time MyPods and Boomsticks aired near the end of 2008, Apple's products had already built an unusually strong and devoted customer base, often described by outside observers as closer to genuine brand loyalty than ordinary customer preference. Comic book guys smashing a screen simply because he felt personally insulted on a brand's behalf works as a direct exaggeration of that same real-world devotion, taking something that was already noticeable in real customer behavior and stretching it just far enough to become a punchline. The episode also lines up neatly with something Apple itself had built directly into its own advertising during this same period. Apple's Think Different campaign, which the real company used throughout the late 1990s and much of the 2000s, was built around presenting Apple's products as tools for creative, independent thinkers, often using footage of well-known historical figures known for pushing against convention. Mapple's near-identical version of this slogan, paired directly against the company's true, unspoken motto of no refunds, gives the entire storyline its sharpest point, without needing any further explanation. Advertising language built to inspire customers, an actual company policy built built to protect profits do not always match up, and the show uses Maple specifically to place those two things side by side in the clearest way possible, where Mr. Burns represents personal, direct control over a company built around one man's fortune, and Sprawlmart represents a massive retail chain, quietly shaping shopping habits without a single face attached to it. Maple introduces a different kind of business power into the show entirely, one built around a devoted, almost obsessive customer base, willing to defend a company's reputation, even when nobody has actually attacked it. Steve Mobs never has to convince Comic Book Guy to smash a screen on his behalf. That loyalty already exists on its own, built up over years of owning and loving the company's products, ready to be triggered the moment something feels even slightly threatening to the brand. Maple does not need to force anyone into anything the way Kid First Industries forced its way into owning an entire school. It simply needs customers who already want to defend it, wallets already prepared to pay whatever debt shows up on a bill, and a slogan catchy enough that a child can be made to repeat it out loud on a street corner without anyone stopping to ask why. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next company the show turns its attention toward does not need a devoted customer base or flashy advertising slogans either. Instead, it simply needs a calendar and one invented holiday timed perfectly to convince an entire town that buying more all at once is something worth celebrating. Section 5. Costingtons and the Invention of Love Day. Trash of the Titans is the 22nd episode of the 9th season of The Simpsons. It aired on April 26, 1998, and it holds a special place in the show's history for a very simple reason. It was the 200th episode ever broadcast. The episode was written by Ian Maxtone Graham and directed by Jim Reardon. It also features the rock band U2 appearing as themselves, and actor Steve Martin guest starring as Ray Patterson, the man who holds the job of Springfield's sanitation commissioner for most of the episode. While the story eventually turns into a tale about local politics and a garbage crisis, it begins with something much smaller, a single joke about a department store deciding the town needs a brand new holiday, one built for no reason other than to sell more products during a slow part of the year. The department store behind this invented holiday is called Costingtons. Early in the episode, executives at Costingtons realize that the middle of the year, the stretch of months sitting between major shopping seasons like Christmas and other established holidays, does not give them a strong enough reason to push shoppers into spending money. Rather than accepting a quiet sales period, the executives simply create a new holiday out of nothing, calling it Love Day. The holiday is built to combine two very different existing traditions into one. It borrows the romantic, heart-filled imagery normally associated with Valentine's Day, while attaching it to the same kind of large-scale gift buying usually reserved for Christmas. In other words, Love Day exists purely as a business decision, dressed up to look like a heartfelt occasion, when its actual purpose is simply to give a department store another excuse to sell products during a month that would otherwise bring in less money. The Simpson family, like the rest of Springfield, treats Love Day as a completely normal, established holiday, filling their home with decorations and gifts built around this brand new occasion without ever questioning where it came from or why it suddenly exists. This detail matters because it shows exactly how effective an invented holiday can be, at least inside the world of the show, once it is presented with enough confidence and enough matching merchandise sitting on store shelves. Nobody in Springfield seems to remember a time before Love Day existed, and nobody stops to ask why a department store happened to be the one that introduced it. The holiday simply becomes part of the calendar because a business decided it should be, and everyone in town goes along with it without much resistance. The joke behind Love Day connects to something that has been a real point of discussion for many years regarding how certain holidays and shopping occasions grow in popularity. Several modern gift-giving holidays and traditions did not always exist in the form people recognize today, and some grew significantly in popularity, partly because retailers and manufacturers found ways to encourage more spending around them. Valentine's Day itself, while rooted in older historical traditions, grew into a major greeting card and gift-buying occasion, partly through the efforts of companies selling cards, candy, and flowers, all of whom benefited directly from convincing more people to treat the day as an important one to buy for. Similarly, the tradition of giving diamond engagement rings became far more common in the United States after a well-known advertising campaign in the 20th century successfully connected the idea of lasting love directly to the purchase of a diamond, even though that connection was not nearly as automatic or expected in earlier generations. These real examples show that Love Day, while clearly exaggerated for comedy inside the show, is not built entirely out of nowhere. It reflects a pattern that has actually shaped how some real holidays and traditions grew stronger over time, often with help from companies that stood to profit directly from that growth. Love Day serves mainly as the spark that gets the episode's main plot moving. After the Simpson family celebrates the holiday, their home fills up with the usual mess left behind by a house full of decorations and unwanted gifts. The trash from this Love Day celebration begins to pile up inside their trash cans, setting the stage for the argument that follows. Homer, who dislikes taking out the trash under normal circumstances, waits until the very last moment, right as the garbage truck is due to arrive. When the truck actually shows up, the workers drive past the house without stopping, since Homer has not gotten the trash out to the curb in time. Furious about being passed over, Homer shouts insults at the garbage collectors as they drive away. Rather than letting the insult go, the workers respond by cutting off the Simpson family's trash collection service entirely, refusing to come back and collect their garbage until Homer offers an apology for the way he spoke to them. Homer, true to his usual stubbornness, refuses to apologize, insisting that the garbage workers will eventually come crawling back to collect the trash on their own. Instead, the opposite happens. Garbage begins piling up higher and higher in the Simpson family's front yard, growing large enough that neighbors start to complain, and even simple tasks, like the children leaving the house for school, become genuinely difficult because of the mess blocking their way. Marge, tired of watching the situation spiral without any sign of Homer backing down, eventually takes matters into her own hands. She writes an apology letter addressed to the sanitation department, but instead of sending it under her own name, she forges Homer's signature, hoping he will never find out and that the trash service will simply resume as though nothing happened. The plan works, at least at first. One morning, Homer wakes up to find the yard completely clear of garbage and immediately assumes he has won some kind of standoff against the garbage workers, believing they finally gave in first. His celebration does not last long. Marge eventually admits what she actually did, revealing that she wrote the apology letter herself and signed Homer's name to it without telling him. Homer reacts with outrage, insisting that Marge has cost him his dignity by apologizing on his behalf for something he still believes he was right about. Rather than letting the matter rest, he decides to go speak directly with Ray Patterson, Springfield's sanitation commissioner, hoping to get the forged apology letter back and erase any record of it ever being sent. This visit to Ray Patterson's office becomes the turning point that pushes the episode away from a story about one messy front yard and toward a much bigger story about local government and unchecked power. After being thrown out of Patterson's office during his attempt to reclaim the letter, Homer decides, almost on impulse, that he should simply run for sanitation commissioner himself, challenging Patterson directly for the job. Homer's campaign has almost nothing to do with real policy ideas or experience managing a city department. Instead, he builds his entire platform around a simple, appealing promise, telling Springfield residents that they should not have to deal with the hassle of taking out their own trash properly, essentially campaigning on the idea that somebody else should handle the responsibility for them. This kind of promise, built purely around convenience and telling voters exactly what they want to hear, rather than what might actually be realistic or sustainable, connects the episode's earlier joke about a manufactured holiday to a similar idea applied to local politics. Just as Costington's invented Love Day purely to sell more products without worrying about the mess it created afterward, Homer's campaign promises voters an easier life without any real plan for how the town will actually manage its garbage responsibly going forward. To everyone's surprise, including his own family, Homer wins the election in a landslide, becoming Springfield's new sanitation Sanitation Commissioner. His time in office starts off looking like a success. He introduces new, flashy programs meant to make trash collection feel exciting and effortless, including hiring recognizable celebrities to work alongside the sanitation department, a move that generates plenty of enthusiasm and attention from Springfield residents, even though it does very little to actually improve how efficiently garbage gets collected and processed.
Rather than budgeting responsibly, Homer's policies quickly begin draining the sanitation department's funds, spending heavily on public appeal rather than on the practical costs of actually running a working waste system.
Facing a serious budget crisis as a direct result of his own decisions, Homer comes up with one final scheme meant to bring in enough money to keep the department running, agreeing to let other cities across the country ship their unwanted garbage into Springfield, using an old abandoned mine near the town as a massive dumping ground in exchange for payment. This plan briefly solves the immediate money problem, bringing in enough outside cash to cover the shortfall Homer's earlier spending created.
However, the abandoned mine cannot actually hold the enormous amount of garbage being shipped in from across the country, and the situation eventually spirals out of control entirely, with garbage beginning to erupt up out of the ground across the entire town, overwhelming Springfield in trash from every direction at once. With the town now buried under waste it can no longer manage, Mayor Quimby is forced to consider an extreme solution. Rather than finding any realistic way to clean up the disaster Homer's policies created, Quimby's plan B involves physically relocating the entire town of Springfield a short distance away, essentially abandoning the polluted land Homer's decisions left behind, rather than actually solving the underlying problem. Lisa, watching this plan unfold, raises a concern that the same lazy, short-term attitude toward waste management that caused this disaster in the first place will simply follow the town to its new location if nothing about people's actual habits and priorities changes. Her warning goes largely unheard, and the episode's final scenes show the abandoned, garbage-covered land where Springfield used to sit, a landscape completely overwhelmed by trash for miles in every direction. The episode's very last image carries a specific reference that connects directly back to a real advertising campaign from decades earlier. As Homer carelessly tosses aside a bag of potato chips near the ruined land, the camera shows a Native American man standing nearby who sheds a single tear upon seeing the destruction, before being warned by another member of his tribe not to turn around and look again. This scene is built as a direct visual reference to a real television commercial that aired in the United States in 1971, often remembered today simply as the Crying Indian ad. That real ad, produced by an organization called Keep America Beautiful, showed a Native American man traveling by canoe through increasingly polluted landscapes, ending with litter being thrown at his feet from a passing car, followed by a single tear rolling down his face, accompanied by narration warning viewers that people start pollution and people can stop it. What makes this reference especially sharp is a detail about the real ad that only became widely known and discussed more clearly in later years. Keep America Beautiful, the organization behind the original 1971 commercial, had been founded years earlier with financial backing from several large companies, including major beverage and packaging companies that manufactured disposable bottles, cans, and other single-use containers. These same kinds of products made up a large share of the litter the ad specifically blamed on ordinary individual behavior. Critics who studied the campaign years later pointed out that focusing public attention entirely on individual littering allowed the companies funding the organization to avoid closer scrutiny over their own manufacturing choices, since the ad placed the entire burden of solving pollution on personal responsibility rather than on decisions made by the companies producing so much of the disposable packaging in the first place. The Simpsons, borrowing this exact imagery for its own polluted, trash-covered ending, adds a layer of meaning that goes beyond a simple visual joke. It quietly places Homer's individual carelessness, tossing aside a chip bag without a second thought, right next to a piece of real advertising history that had already been criticized for shifting blame away from the businesses most responsible for the packaging waste being produced in the first place. Despite its serious ending, Trash of the Titans found real success with critics and award voters. The episode
episode won the Emmy Award for Outstanding Animated Program for programming 1 hour or less, a recognition the show's own staff have said they believe was influenced specifically by the strong environmental message built into the episode's conclusion. Winning this award for an episode built around an invented shopping holiday, a garbage crisis, and a direct reference to a genuinely controversial piece of real-world advertising history shows how effectively the show blended entertainment with a message about consumer culture and environmental responsibility wrapped inside jokes about rock stars, forged apology letters, and a hapless father who simply did not want to take out his own trash. Costington's invention of Love Day sets a pattern that runs through the entire episode, even after the department store itself disappears from the story fairly early on. A business creates something, in this case an entire fake holiday, purely to generate more spending, without any concern for what happens to all the waste that celebration leaves behind. Homer's political campaign later repeats this same basic pattern on a larger scale, promising voters an easier life without any real concern for the long-term cost of that convenience, until the entire town ends up buried under the consequences of decisions made purely to feel good in the moment, rather than to actually work in the long run. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next section moves away from invented department store holidays and unmanageable garbage crises and turns instead toward a company that did not need to invent anything new to make its presence felt inside Springfield. It simply needed to own the very network broadcasting the show itself, creating a strange and very real situation where a business found itself being mocked again and again by a cartoon it was paying to put on the air. Section 6. Fox bought The Simpsons, then watched itself get mocked for decades. The Simpsons has never aired on just any network. Since its first full episode broadcast on December 17, 1989, the show has run on the Fox Broadcasting Company, a network owned by media companies controlled by Rupert Murdoch. This detail matters more than it might seem at first, because for over 3 decades, the show has repeatedly turned around and made jokes directly about Fox itself, the very same company paying to put the cartoon on television every week. Very few shows in television history have spent so many years mocking the business that owns them, and even fewer have done it as openly and as often as The Simpsons has. This pattern of self-mockery shows up most clearly through invented television programs the show has placed inside its own fictional version of the Fox network. Throughout its run, The Simpsons has shown characters watching made-up shows with names built to sound like real Fox programming taken to an exaggerated extreme. Shows with invented titles like When Buildings Collapse and When Surgeries Go Wrong have appeared as background jokes, built to poke fun at how far a network built around a certain amount of shock and simple entertainment might be willing to go. These fictional show titles were never subtle. They existed specifically to suggest that Fox, as a real company, cared more about grabbing attention through exaggerated or sensational programming than about producing thoughtful, high-quality television. The joke works because it comes from inside the company's own broadcast slot, aired on the actual network being made fun of, with no outside voice needed to make the point for it. One of the clearest and most specific examples of this pattern comes from the season 10 episode called When You Dish Upon a Star, which aired in 1998. In this episode, Homer accidentally becomes the personal assistant to real-life actors Alec Baldwin and Kim Basinger, who are shown living in Springfield while trying to avoid constant attention from photographers chasing celebrity photos. Toward the end of the episode, the story shifts toward a character named Ron Howard, a real film director appearing as a version of himself who steals one of Homer's ideas for a movie script and pitches it directly to executives at 20th Century Fox, the real movie studio connected to the Fox Media Company. As this pitch scene plays out, a sign appears on screen showing the 20th Century Fox studio logo, and directly beneath it, in smaller print, the sign reads, "A division of Walt Disney Company." At the time this episode aired in 1998, nothing like that was actually true. Fox and Disney were separate, competing media companies, and nobody watching the episode at the time had any particular reason to expect that would ever change. The joke, as originally originally written, worked simply as an exaggerated, silly idea, the notion that one giant entertainment company might someday swallow up another. Nearly 20 years later, in December of 2017, Disney formally announced an agreement to purchase a large portion of 21st Century Fox's entertainment assets, a deal reported at the time to be worth around $52.4 billion. Once the deal was completed in 2019, 20th Century Fox, the very studio joked about inside that 1998 episode, did in fact become a division of the Walt Disney Company, exactly matching what the show's background joke had displayed nearly 2 decades earlier. News of this real-world deal spread quickly once fans of the show noticed the connection between the actual announcement and the old episode.
Screenshots of the 1998 joke were shared widely online, and multiple entertainment news outlets picked up the story, treating it as one of the more striking examples of the show appearing to predict a real event years before it happened. Al Jean, one of the show's longtime executive producers and writers, responded publicly to the attention the joke received once the merger news broke, posting a comment suggesting that people were making far too much out of what he considered nothing more than a funny coincidence. Whether the writers behind that 1998 episode had any real inside knowledge about future media industry deals, or simply picked a joke that happened to line up with how the entertainment business eventually moved, the reaction to the coincidence became its own small piece of television history, discussed by entertainment reporters and Simpsons fans alike for years afterward. This particular joke fits inside a much larger pattern the show has followed for its entire run, one where the writers treat Fox less like an untouchable boss and more like just another target worth making fun of, the same way the show pokes fun at Springfield's mayor, its local news anchor, or its nuclear plant owner. This willingness to turn jokes back on the very companies signing the checks stands out as unusual inside the television industry more broadly. Most shows, understandably, avoid openly criticizing or mocking the network paying to produce and broadcast them, since doing so could create tension with the very people responsible for deciding whether a show gets renewed for another season. The Simpsons, largely because of the creative freedom it earned after becoming a massive early hit for Fox, was given unusually wide room to break that unwritten rule repeatedly, almost turning it into one of the show's signature comedic techniques, rather than something the writers needed to hide or soften. Part of what allowed this pattern to continue for so long comes down to simple business success. The Simpsons became an enormous hit almost immediately after its debut in 1989, quickly turning into one of Fox's most valuable and recognizable shows. A network built around a series that popular has strong financial reasons to keep that show running smoothly, even if the show occasionally pokes fun at the company itself. As long as audiences kept watching and advertisers kept paying to reach those audiences, Fox had every incentive to let the writers keep their creative freedom largely intact, even when that freedom included jokes aimed squarely at the network's own reputation and business decisions. The show's willingness to mock its own network connects to something television researchers and critics have written about for years regarding self-aware or self-referential comedy, sometimes described as a show acknowledging its own existence as a television program, rather than pretending to exist inside a completely separate, sealed-off fictional world. Many comedies over the decades have included moments where characters seem to notice they are part of a television show, breaking away briefly from the illusion that the story exists completely on its own. The Simpsons pushed this idea further than most shows around it by consistently aiming that awareness specifically at its own real-world corporate owner, rather than simply making general jokes about television as an industry. The show did not just acknowledge that it existed on television, it specifically and repeatedly pointed out who owned the network broadcasting it, and made a running joke out of exactly how odd that relationship could be. This tradition of Fox self-mockery did not stay confined only to The Simpsons either. Other animated comedies that later aired on the same network, including Family Guy and Futurama, picked up similar habits of poking fun at Fox itself, often referencing the network's tendency to cancel shows quickly if ratings dropped, or joking about Fox's general reputation for programming built around reality competition
competition shows, and other lower-cost forms of entertainment.
This wider pattern across multiple Fox shows became well known enough that fan-made video compilations dedicated entirely to collecting these kinds of jokes have circulated online for years, gathering clips specifically showing Fox programs making fun of their own network across different shows and different decades. The Simpsons, as the longest-running and earliest example of this style of joke among Fox's major animated comedies, effectively set the tone that these later shows continued to build on. Fox's ownership situation itself also shifted in ways that gave the show even more material to work with over time. Rupert Murdoch built his media empire gradually, expanding from newspaper ownership in his native Australia into a much larger collection of television networks, film studios, and other media properties across the world, including gaining control of 20th Century Fox and launching the Fox Broadcasting Company in the United States during the 1980s. This same broader company later expanded further to include Fox News Channel, a separate cable news network that launched in 1996, giving Murdoch's overall media holdings an even larger and more politically visible presence in American television. Because The Simpsons already had a long-standing habit of joking about its own network's ownership, the later growth of that same ownership group into news and political media simply gave the writers a wider target to aim similar jokes toward, building naturally on a pattern the show had already established years earlier through jokes aimed purely at Fox's entertainment side. The specific joke inside "When You Dish Upon a Star" also stands out because of how casually it was delivered. The line about Disney ownership was not built into any major plot point or dramatic moment inside the episode. It appears briefly in the background of a single scene, easy to miss entirely on a first viewing. This casual placement fits a broader style the show has often used when making jokes about Fox specifically. Rather than building entire episodes around attacking the network directly, the show tends to slip these jokes in quickly, almost as background details, the same way it might slip in a quick visual gag or a barely noticeable sign in the background of a completely unrelated scene. This approach allowed the writers to include sharp, pointed jokes about their own employer without necessarily drawing the kind of attention that a longer, more dramatic storyline directly targeting Fox's business decisions might have brought. Looking back at the 1998 joke now, knowing exactly how the real Disney and Fox merger eventually played out, adds an extra layer of interest that the original writers could not have fully predicted at the time. The Simpsons itself, along with its entire library of past episodes, became Disney's property once that 2019 deal was completed, meaning the very episode that joked about Fox becoming a division of Disney years earlier eventually became, quite literally, a piece of Disney's own media library. This detail turns the original joke into something slightly more layered than a simple lucky guess about the future. The show did not just joke about a hypothetical business deal happening to some other company somewhere out in the world. It joked, entirely by accident, about its own eventual change in ownership, years before that change ever became a real possibility being discussed in the entertainment industry. Al Jean's public response, downplaying the connection as simple coincidence, lines up with how the show's writers have generally responded to similar moments over the years, whenever fans point out an old episode that appears to have predicted some later real-world event. The show has been credited at various points with jokes that seem to anticipate things like autocorrect features on phones, video calling technology similar to FaceTime, and other developments that arrived on the market years after certain jokes originally aired. In nearly every case, including this one involving Fox and Disney, the writers themselves have generally credited these moments to simple chance rather than any deliberate attempt to predict future events, pointing out that a show which has produced hundreds of episodes across more than 3 decades, filled with countless small background jokes and passing references, was always likely to occasionally stumble onto something that technology or business decisions later turned into reality. Regardless of how much credit belongs to genuine insight versus simple probability across so many episodes, the Fox and Disney joke remains one of the clearest examples of the show turning its long-running habit of mocking its own network into something that
that eventually connected directly to a real, enormous business deal. It captures something specific about how comfortable the show's writers became over the years with treating Fox not as an untouchable authority standing above the show, but as just another subject worth joking about. In the same casual, background way the show has always joked about Springfield's power plant, its local news station, or its overstuffed shopping mall. Fox's willingness to let this kind of joke continue airing on its own network for so many years also says something about how the relationship between the show and the company evolved over time. A joke about Fox eventually being purchased by a rival company could easily have been cut during editing if network executives had wanted to avoid drawing attention to that kind of idea. Instead, the joke aired exactly as written, sitting quietly in the background of a 1998 episode until fans rediscovered it nearly 20 years later and gave it new meaning once the real deal was finally announced. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. This particular joke about Fox's ownership turned out to be one of the milder examples of the show poking fun at its own network. Other moments went much further, directly mocking specific real-world content Fox actually aired, sometimes prompting a reaction from the network far more serious than a simple shrug, including one particular parody that came close to triggering an actual legal threat from inside the very same media company that owned the show. Section 7. The Fox News Ticker Joke. Fox almost sued its own show over. By the early 2000s, The Simpsons had already spent more than a decade poking fun at Fox, the network broadcasting the show every week. Most of those jokes stayed fairly gentle, background references to invented shows, or quick visual gags easy to miss on a first watch. That pattern shifted in 2003, when the show aired an episode built around a fictional political campaign involving Krusty the Clown, one of Springfield's most recognizable television performers. The episode, remembered afterward as Krusty for Congress, included a parody built specifically around Fox News Channel, a real cable news network owned by the same larger media company that owned the Fox Broadcasting Company airing The Simpsons itself. This particular joke did something none of the show's earlier Fox-related humor had done before. It pushed the network's patience far enough that, according to the show's own creator, Fox seriously considered taking legal action against a show it owned outright. The joke itself centered on a small strip of text that scrolls continuously along the bottom of a television screen, a feature real news channels commonly use to display short headlines or breaking updates while a main broadcast continues above it. Fox News Channel had used this kind of scrolling text, often called a news crawl, as part of its regular broadcast style. The Simpsons built a parody version of this exact feature, showing a similar scrolling strip of text running along the bottom of the screen during a scene meant to mock Fox News directly, filled with a series of exaggerated, clearly fake headlines designed to poke fun at what the show's writers viewed as a rightward political lean coming from the real news channel. The specific fake headlines that appeared during this parody news crawl became widely reported afterward, repeated by multiple entertainment and media outlets covering the story once it became public. Among the lines that scrolled across the screen were statements reading, "Do Democrats cause cancer?" and another reading, "Study, 92% of Democrats are gay," both written specifically to exaggerate and mock what the show's writers saw as an unfair or slanted approach to covering political topics tied to one particular party. Another line joked that JFK posthumously joins Republican Party, poking fun at how selectively certain news outlets might frame historical political figures depending on which political narrative best suited their coverage. A separate line joked that pointless news crawls up 37%, turning the joke directly back onto the very feature being parodied, mocking the increasing use of scrolling text crawls across cable news broadcasts in general. One
additional headline read, "Oil slicks found to keep seals young, supple," an absurd, unrelated-sounding claim built purely for comedic effect, showing how far the writers were willing to stretch the joke beyond strictly political material. This same episode also included a separate, closely connected joke involving Rupert Murdoch, the real media executive whose companies owned both Fox News Channel and the Fox Broadcasting Company airing The Simpsons. Murdoch actually provided his own voice for a brief cameo appearance in this same general period of the show, playing a version of himself. In this cameo, Murdoch's character introduces himself directly by saying, "I'm Rupert Murdoch, the billionaire tyrant, and this is my skybox," a line delivered by the real Murdoch himself rather than an actor imitating him. The scene takes place inside a private skybox, a term used for an enclosed, private viewing area often found in large sports stadiums, reserved for wealthy guests or executives to watch games from an exclusive space rather than sitting among the general public. Homer, in the scene, ends up inside this same skybox and is quickly told by Murdoch to leave, since the space belongs exclusively to him. The joke lands specifically because Murdoch agreed to voice himself using a phrase, "billionaire tyrant," that openly mocks his own wealth and influence, spoken by the same real person the joke was aimed at. Word of the tensions surrounding the news crawl parody became public specifically because Matt Groening, the creator of The Simpsons, discussed it directly during an interview with National Public Radio, a real news organization often referred to by its initials, NPR. Speaking with NPR host Terry Gross on her program Fresh Air, Groening explained that Fox News Channel had reacted strongly to the parody news crawl once the episode aired, going so far as to threaten legal action against the show over it. According to Groening, executives connected to Fox News felt the parody had gone too far and considered bringing a lawsuit against the very show being broadcast by their own larger media company. Groening described the situation using a specific phrase that was repeated widely once his comments circulated through news coverage of the story. He explained that the show's staff decided to call their bluff, betting that Rupert Murdoch would not actually want to spend money paying for one part of his own company, Fox News, to sue another part of that same company, the Fox Broadcasting Company responsible for airing The Simpsons. Groening stated plainly that the show's staff simply did not believe Murdoch would follow through with an actual lawsuit under those circumstances, since it would have meant one branch of his own business paying legal costs specifically to fight against another branch of that exact same business. According to Groening, this bet paid off, and no lawsuit was ever formally filed. Despite avoiding an actual legal case, Groening indicated that the situation did lead to a real, lasting change in how future episodes of the show were allowed to use this specific kind of joke. He explained that following the reaction to the parody news crawl, Fox introduced a new internal rule preventing the show from using similar fake news crawls in future episodes. Groening quoted the reasoning given for this new rule directly during his NPR interview, explaining that the stated concern was that viewers watching a cartoon might become confused and mistakenly believe a fake scrolling text crawl represented real news information rather than a parody built purely for comedic purposes. Whether or not that explanation reflected genuine concern about viewer confusion or simply provided a more polite-sounding reason to quietly shut down a type of joke that had clearly upset people at Fox News, the practical result was the same. The show stopped using that specific kind of parody news crawl gag in the years that followed this particular controversy. Fox News Channel itself responded publicly to Groening's comments once his NPR interview became widely reported by other news outlets. A spokesperson speaking on behalf of the network pushed back directly against the idea that any lawsuit had ever seriously been considered, stating that the network was scratching its head over the entire claim and insisting that Fox News had actually enjoyed the parody and considered it a great bit of comedy rather than something worth threatening legal action over. Separately, the team producing The Simpsons issued their own statement following the same wave of media coverage, describing Groening's remarks during the NPR interview as satirical in nature, and stating clearly that no real tension or dispute had ever actually existed between the show and Fox News regarding this particular episode. This left the public with
two clearly conflicting accounts of the same event. Groening's original interview described specific legal threats and a direct decision by the show's staff to call Fox's bluff, while both Fox News and the show's own producers later downplayed those same claims, describing them instead as an exaggerated or satirical retelling, rather than a literal account of events. Regardless of exactly how serious the legal threat actually was behind closed doors, one detail remained consistent across every version of the story that circulated afterward. Groening specifically and repeatedly stated that a new rule was put into place following this particular episode, restricting the show from using fake news crawls similar to the one that had caused the initial controversy. This detail suggests that even if no formal lawsuit was ever filed or seriously pursued, something about the parody clearly bothered people connected to Fox News enough to result in an actual, lasting change to what the writers were later allowed to include in future episodes. A joke serious enough to produce a permanent restriction on future content, even without a courtroom ever getting involved, still represents a real and meaningful reaction from inside the company airing the show. The wider media coverage surrounding this story spread well beyond the original NPR interview itself. Multiple entertainment and news outlets picked up Groening's comments and published their own versions of the story shortly afterward, repeating the specific fake headlines from the parody news crawl and quoting Groening's explanation of how the show's staff decided to call Fox's bluff rather than remove the segment before it aired. Some coverage extended the story further by connecting it to a separate, real legal dispute that had occurred around roughly the same period, involving Fox News Channel attempting to sue author and comedian Al Franken over the title of one of his books, which directly referenced and mocked Fox News' own on-air slogan describing itself as fair and balanced. That particular real lawsuit against Franken had already drawn significant public attention on its own, and some commentary discussing the Simpsons parody controversy specifically pointed back to that earlier Franken case, suggesting that Fox News had already developed a reputation around this same general period for reacting strongly, sometimes through legal threats, whenever its own on-air branding or reputation became the target of parody or criticism from outside sources. The Krusty for Congress news crawl parody stands apart from most of the show's other Fox-related jokes for one very specific reason. Nearly every other example of the show mocking its own network, from invented sensational-sounding program titles to the background joke about Fox eventually becoming a division of Disney, stayed relatively low stakes, producing entertaining stories for fans and reporters to discuss without any indication that real tension existed behind the scenes at the company itself. The Fox News ticker parody appears to be one of the very few instances where a joke aimed at the show's own broader media company produced enough real friction, according to Groening's own account, to result in an actual restriction placed on future episodes, regardless of how the specific details were later downplayed publicly by both sides involved. This particular controversy also highlights something important about the difference between Fox Broadcasting Company, the entertainment network responsible for airing The Simpsons, and Fox News Channel, the separate cable news network owned by a related but distinct part of the larger media company controlled by Rupert Murdoch. While both networks ultimately connected back to Murdoch's ownership, they operated as separate businesses with separate leadership, separate audiences, and clearly separate purposes. One focused on entertainment programming, and the other focused specifically on news coverage. The tension described by Groening did not come from Fox Broadcasting Company itself objecting to a joke aimed at its own entertainment programming. It came specifically from people connected to Fox News Channel, a different part of the same overall company, reacting to a parody that directly targeted their own specific news coverage and on-air presentation style. This detail helps explain exactly why Groening described the situation the way he did, describing it as one part of Murdoch's business potentially suing another part of that same business, rather than simply Fox as a single, unified company turning against its own long-running cartoon. Rupert Murdoch's own decision to voice himself for the billionaire tyrant cameo, appearing directly on the very network he owned to deliver a line mocking his own wealth and power, adds adds an interesting layer of contrast when placed next to the far more serious reaction that reportedly followed the separate Fox News ticker parody. Murdoch himself appeared willing, at least in that one specific instance, to personally take part in a joke aimed squarely at his own reputation as an extremely wealthy and powerful businessman.
Yet, according to Groening, a much smaller, quicker parody aimed specifically at Fox News' style of political coverage produced a far more serious reaction from people connected to that particular part of Murdoch's company. This contrast suggests that different parts of Murdoch's overall business empire reacted very differently to being made fun of, depending on exactly what kind of joke was being told and which specific part of the company that joke happened to target. Taken together, the Fox News ticker parody and Murdoch's own billionaire tyrant cameo capture two very different sides of the same overall relationship between The Simpsons and the massive media company that has owned it since the show's very first episode aired in 1989. On one side, the show has been given remarkable freedom over the decades to joke about its own network, sometimes even inviting Murdoch himself to personally take part in jokes built around his own power and wealth. On the other side, at least one specific parody, aimed directly at Fox News rather than at Fox Broadcasting Company itself, appears to have pushed that same freedom right up against a real limit, producing a reaction serious enough, according to the show's own creator, to result in an actual lasting rule change, affecting what the writers were later allowed to include in future episodes. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. This entire episode of real-world tension between a show and its own broadcaster stayed relatively contained to a single controversy over a single kind of joke. The billionaire tyrant himself, having already agreed to mock his own reputation once on the very show he owned, would go on to become just one entry in a much longer list of real and fictional powerful business figures the show chose to place directly inside its own version of Springfield. Some drawn entirely from imagination, and others, like Murdoch himself, brought in using their own actual voice to deliver a joke aimed squarely at their own real-world power. Section 8. Rupert Murdoch plays himself as the billionaire tyrant. The episode where Rupert Murdoch appears as himself is called Sunday, Cruddy Sunday. It is the 12th episode of the 10th season of The Simpsons, and it holds a specific place in the show's broadcast history because it aired directly after Super Bowl 33 on January 31st, 1999. The episode was written by Tom Martin, George Meyer, Brian Scully, and Mike Scully, and directed by Stephen Dean Moore. Fox had scheduled the episode to air right after the biggest football game of the year, a common strategy real television networks use to place a popular show directly after a major sporting event, hoping to hold on to the huge audience already watching football and carry those viewers straight into the next program. Along with Murdoch, the episode brought in a long list of real guest stars playing themselves, including football players Troy Aikman, Dan Marino, and Rosie Greer, sports commentators John Madden and Pat Summerall, and singer Dolly Parton, alongside actor Fred Willard playing a fictional travel agent named Wally Kogan. The episode's plot follows Homer after he meets Kogan, who offers him a free trip to the Super Bowl in Miami if Homer can convince enough of his friends to sign up for a travel package. Homer gathers Moe, Barney, Lenny, Carl, Kirk Van Houten, and several other Springfield men, and the group rides a bus down to Miami together. Once they arrive at the stadium, they discover that the tickets Kogan sold them are fake, missing the security hologram real tickets are supposed to have printed for a football team that does not actually exist, and, in one of the episode's more absurd touches, printed on material that turns out to be edible. The group ends up locked in a holding cell underneath the stadium, and only escapes because Dolly Parton, playing herself, happens to know Kogan personally and helps free them using a bottle of her own extra-strength makeup remover to dissolve the lock. Once free, Homer and his friends stumble into a private, heavily decorated viewing room reserved for wealthy guests, sitting high above the stadium seats where regular ticket holders watch the game. This kind of private room is often called a skybox, a real term used at large stadiums and arenas to describe an enclosed, exclusive viewing space, usually reserved for a company's top executives, wealthy season ticket holders, or other important guests, rather than for the general public buying regular seats.
seats. Homer and his group, having no idea whose skybox they have wandered into, begin eating and drinking everything available inside, treating the private space like their own personal party. The mood shifts suddenly when a helicopter lands directly on the glass roof above them. A man steps out and takes an elevator down to the level where Homer's group is standing, flanked by two guards dressed in dark suits. The man introduces himself immediately and directly, saying the line that would go on to become one of the most quoted moments to come out of any celebrity cameo on the show. He says, "I'm Rupert Murdoch, the billionaire tyrant, and this is my skybox."
The joke lands specifically because the voice delivering that line does not belong to a voice actor doing an impression. It belongs to the real Rupert Murdoch, agreeing to record his own lines for the episode, describing his own real-life wealth and power using the exact word tyrant, a term that normally describes a harsh, unfair ruler, applied here directly to himself on the very network he owned, inside a joke he had personally agreed to be part of. Murdoch's animated version does not simply deliver that one line and leave. Once he realizes strangers have broken into his private skybox and are eating his food, he orders his guards to remove them by force. Homer and his friends flee the skybox in a chaotic scramble, running from Murdoch's security guards in a style the episode plays for pure slapstick comedy, more focused on fast-paced physical chaos than on making any deeper point about Murdoch specifically. The group eventually escapes onto the actual football field itself, then continues running straight into the winning team's locker room, where they end up celebrating alongside the players and, in typical Homer fashion, walk away with a stolen Super Bowl trophy by the episode's end. Murdoch's decision to appear as himself in this episode connects to a much longer, real career spent building one of the largest media companies in the world, a career that began decades before The Simpsons ever existed. Keith Rupert Murdoch was born on March 11th, 1931, on a farm south of Melbourne, Australia. His father, Keith Murdoch, was already a well-known Australian journalist and newspaper owner, giving Rupert an early connection to the newspaper business through his own family before he ever built a company of his own. In 1952, Rupert Murdoch inherited a newspaper in Adelaide, Australia called The News, following his father's death, and he spent the following years buying up additional newspapers across Australia and expanding his reach further. In 1969, Murdoch moved into the British newspaper market, purchasing The News of the World and later The Sun, two widely read British tabloid papers, before expanding into the United States market during the 1970s. In 1979, Murdoch founded News Corporation, commonly shortened to News Corp, the company that would eventually grow into one of the largest media conglomerates in the entire world. Owning newspapers alone was not where Murdoch's ambitions stopped. During the 1980s, after becoming a United States citizen in 1985, a step required at the time for him to legally own an American television network, Murdoch launched the Fox Broadcasting Company, creating an entirely new major television network in a country that, at the time, had been dominated for decades by only 3 other major networks. Fox grew steadily throughout the following years, eventually building a lineup that included The Simpsons, which debuted as a full series in 1989 and quickly became one of the network's biggest early hits, helping establish Fox as a serious competitor in primetime television. Murdoch's company later expanded even further, launching Fox Sports in 1994 and Fox News Channel in 1996, followed later by additional channels including FX and FXX, alongside a wide collection of international television holdings such as British satellite broadcaster B-Sky B and Star TV in India. Murdoch's decision to buy the Dow Jones Company in 2007, which owns the Wall Street Journal, one of the most respected financial newspapers in the United States, expanded his reach even further into serious, widely trusted journalism, adding to a media portfolio that already stretched from tabloid papers all the way up to a major financial newspaper trusted by investors and business leaders around the world. This purchase drew significant attention and criticism at the time from people concerned about how much media influence was becoming concentrated under a single company's ownership, a concern that had already followed Murdoch for years
given how many newspapers, television networks, and other media properties he had gathered under News Corp by that point. Murdoch's career has not been free of serious controversy either. In July of 2011, his London newspaper, News of the World, became the center of a major scandal after investigators found evidence that staff members at the paper had been illegally accessing the private voicemail messages of celebrities, members of the British royal family, and even relatives of murder victims and British soldiers killed during the war in Afghanistan, a practice generally referred to as phone hacking. The scandal grew large enough that Murdoch made the decision to shut down News of the World entirely in July of 2011, ending publication of a newspaper that had been running continuously for over 160 years. Murdoch was later called to testify before British lawmakers about what he knew regarding the hacking, telling them directly that he had been unaware it was happening within his own company. The scandal also affected his son, James Murdoch, who had been widely seen as the likely future leader of the company, and who stepped down from several of his leadership positions as the controversy continued to unfold. Given this real history, Murdoch's Simpsons cameo takes on an added layer worth understanding clearly. The Rupert Murdoch shown in Sunday, Cruddy Sunday, is not simply a random businessman written into the script for a quick joke. He is one of the most powerful and, at times, one of the most heavily criticized media figures in the world, appearing on a show that exists specifically because his own company decided to fund and broadcast it. According to a tribute written for Murdoch's induction into the Television Academy Hall of Fame in 2014, Murdoch actually appeared on The Simpsons on 3 separate occasions across the show's run, with the tribute specifically noting that in nearly every one of these appearances, he seemed genuinely willing to poke fun at his own reputation, delivering his lines with visible enthusiasm rather than treating the joke as something to be embarrassed about. The specific phrase, billionaire tyrant, carries extra weight once placed next to Murdoch's real biography. A tyrant, in its ordinary meaning, describes a ruler who holds complete power over people and uses that power harshly or unfairly, often without much concern for how that power affects the people beneath them. Murdoch, by 1999, already controlled an enormous stretch of newspapers, television networks, and other media properties spread across multiple countries, giving him real influence over what information reached millions of people through his various outlets. Choosing to describe himself using a word like tyrant inside a joke he personally agreed to record dialogue for shows a level of comfort with self-mockery that stands out clearly against how seriously his real-world business decisions and media influence have often been discussed and debated by journalists, lawmakers, and media critics over the years. At the same time, the joke itself, taken purely as a piece of comedy inside the episode, stays fairly lighthearted. Murdoch's animated character does not deliver any kind of extended speech about business or media power. He simply introduces himself using that one memorable line, then quickly moves into ordering his security guards to chase a group of strangers out of his private skybox, turning the entire moment into a piece of fast-paced slapstick rather than a serious commentary on wealth or corporate influence. This fits a pattern that shows up throughout the show's history of using real celebrities and real business figures as guest voices. The joke rarely asks these real people to seriously confront criticism of their actual careers on screen. Instead, it usually asks them to simply show up, deliver a self-aware line acknowledging their own public reputation, and then step aside to let the show's regular cast continue driving the actual story forward. Murdoch's willingness to take part in this kind of joke, especially this early in the show's run, also reflects something about how confident Fox and News Corp were, even by 1999, in the value of keeping The Simpsons as one of the network's signature shows. A company worried about protecting its public image at all costs might have avoided letting its own chairman record dialogue describing himself using a word like tyrant, especially with guards forcibly removing ordinary people from his private space on screen. Instead, Murdoch chose to lean into the joke directly, a decision that likely helped reinforce the show's already established reputation for being willing to make fun of nearly anyone, including the very people signing off on its budget every season. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Murdoch's cameo in Sunday Cruddy Sunday captures one very specific side of how the show has handled real-world corporate power over the years, using an actual executive's own voice to poke fun at his own wealth and reputation, wrapped inside a fast, silly chase scene rather than a serious argument about media ownership. The next section shifts away from a real executive appearing as himself and turns instead toward a fictional character built specifically to update that same basic idea for a newer era, trading a stadium skybox and a media empire for a private island, a search for eternal life, and a tech fortune built on borrowed ideas. Section 9. Peter Linz, the show's 2025 tech billionaire villain. Bart and Frink is the 6th episode of the 37th season of The Simpsons. It first aired on November 9th, 2025, making it one of the most recent episodes available to study when looking at how the show continues to build stories around business and wealth, even after more than 3 decades on the air. The episode was written by Brian Kelly and directed by Rob Oliver. It aired at 8:31 in the evening Eastern Time, a scheduling detail that lined up with a special episode of another animated show called Universal Basic Guys, airing directly beforehand on the same night. The episode brought in 2 notable guest voices: actor Glenn Howerton, known for his long-running role on the comedy series It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, playing a character named Peter Linz, and actor Danny Pudi, known for his role on the comedy series Community, playing a character named Johnson Bryans. Both actors were credited specifically as special guest voices, a detail that highlights how much attention the show placed on these 2 particular performances within the episode. The story begins with Bart taking over as an assistant for Professor Frink, one of Springfield's longtime background scientist characters, first introduced years earlier and known for his eccentric inventions and his habit of speaking in an unusual, stuttering style. After Bart accidentally damages something belonging to Frink during an earlier scene at a local game store, Marge brings Bart to Frink's house so he can apologize directly. Rather than reacting with anger, Frink invites Bart inside, and the 2 of them end up bonding over Frink's collection of inventions sitting around his home laboratory. Marge, watching this new friendship form, suggests that Bart could officially become Frink's lab assistant, and Frink agrees, giving Bart a chance to explore a very different side of Springfield than his usual mischief-making at school. Shortly after Bart takes on this new role, Frink receives an invitation to attend his college reunion held at a private island estate belonging to one of his old classmates. Frink decides to bring the entire Simpson family along with him, and the group soon finds themselves at an extravagant, heavily secured location whose exact name gets bleeped out entirely throughout the episode, a joke built around the idea that the location is so exclusive and so secretive that even mentioning its real name out loud has been legally restricted for the guests attending. This bleeped out location eventually turns out to be New Zealand, a detail revealed later in the episode once Frink accidentally lets the name slip, quickly followed by shocked reactions from the rest of the Simpson family once they realize what they just heard. The classmate hosting this reunion is Peter Linz, voiced by Glenn Howerton, a tech billionaire whose wealth and lifestyle immediately set him apart from any of Springfield's usual cast of local business figures. Linz's private estate includes extravagant, almost absurd displays of wealth, including an entire separate building on the property used purely for storing his Christmas ornaments, despite Linz mentioning that he personally only visits the island itself for a small handful of days each year. This detail works as a specific joke about a certain kind of extreme wealth, where owning something expensive matters more than actually using it regularly, a habit sometimes associated with extremely rich individuals who buy massive properties, yachts, or other expensive items mainly as symbols of status rather than for practical, everyday use. Linz's backstory reveals exactly how he built his fortune, and it centers entirely on taking credit and profit for work that actually belonged to someone else. During the episode, it becomes clear that Professor Frink had originally developed the technology behind voice assistant programs similar to real-world products like Siri and Alexa, digital assistants built into many smartphones and smart home devices that can respond to spoken questions and commands. Rather than crediting Frink for this invention, Linz took the technology and built his own fortune around it, becoming wealthy off an idea that was never actually his own. Frink references this history directly during the episode, explaining that whenever a voice assistant device almost understands what a person is asking for, that small flash of near-working technology traces back to work Frink actually created, even though it was Linz who ended up profiting from it instead.
Bart, hearing this explanation, reacts with visible disbelief that a billionaire could choose money over friendship so completely, especially against someone who had trusted him enough to share his own original invention in the first place. Linz's private island itself carries an additional layer of controversy built directly into the episode's dialogue. While showing off the beautiful scenery surrounding his estate, Linz casually explains that he first saw the exact view from his property displayed on a computer screensaver years earlier, and simply decided he had to own it for himself. When Lisa asks what happened to the people who originally lived on that land before Linz acquired it, he responds by bringing up eminent domain, a real legal term describing a government's power to take private property for public use, usually with some form of payment given to the original owner in exchange. Linz twists this term into a joke entirely at his own expense, admitting that the tribal elders who originally lived on the land certainly had not expected or wanted their land to be taken this way, before laughing about the situation rather than showing any real concern for the people affected. Lisa's reaction to hearing this explanation captures the moment's intended point directly, as she describes Linz and the other billionaires gathered at the reunion as the worst people in the world, a blunt reaction meant to leave no doubt about how the episode wants its audience to view these characters. Linz's ownership of the island also comes with a legal detail meant purely as a dark joke about how extremely wealthy individuals sometimes structure their finances and property ownership. At one point, Linz explains that he does not technically own the island in his own name at all. Instead, he says the actual legal owner is an offshore trust, a type of legal and financial arrangement sometimes set up in another country, specifically to hold wealth or property, controlled by what he calls nominee directors, individuals whose names appear on official paperwork, even though they may hold little or no real decision-making power over the assets involved. Linz delivers this explanation casually, almost bragging about it, treating a complicated legal structure clearly designed to obscure who actually controls the property as simply another interesting detail about his lifestyle, rather than something worth being embarrassed about. This kind of arrangement mirrors real discussions that have taken place over the years regarding how extremely wealthy individuals sometimes use complex legal structures, sometimes based in other countries, to manage large amounts of property or money in ways that make ownership harder to trace directly back to themselves. Danny Pudi's character, Johnson Bryans, represents a slightly different flavor of the same billionaire culture on display throughout the episode. Bryans is portrayed as one of the tech billionaires gathered for the reunion who becomes fixated on the idea that Homer Simpson might hold some kind of secret related to extending human life. This obsession connects to a broader plot thread running through the episode involving several billionaires at the reunion who share an intense interest in using advanced technology and science to slow down or even fully stop the aging process, sometimes referred to casually in the episode and in real-world discussions as a pursuit of eternal life or radical life extension. Bryans, upon hearing some kind of rumor or misunderstanding about Homer's blood carrying unusual properties, becomes desperate to learn Homer's supposed secret, at one point demanding that Homer give up the keys to immortal life, delivering the line with an exaggerated, almost frantic intensity that plays up just how consumed some extremely wealthy individuals can become when chasing an idea that sounds impressive enough to be worth almost any amount of money or effort. This focus on life extension technology inside the episode connects to real conversations that have taken place for years surrounding wealthy individuals and companies interested in anti-aging research and the broader idea of extending the human lifespan well beyond what is currently considered normal. Several real-world technology entrepreneurs and investors have publicly funded research projects and companies focused specifically on studying aging, exploring ideas ranging from specialized diets and supplements to more experimental biological
psychological treatments, all aimed at slowing down or reversing the effects of getting older. Bart and Frink takes this real interest and stretches it into full-blown comedy, imagining a private island reunion filled entirely with wealthy men obsessing over the idea that a regular Springfield resident like Homer might somehow hold the secret they have been searching for, despite Homer having no actual special medical property at all, beyond whatever misunderstanding briefly convinces the group otherwise. Homer's role throughout this billionaire storyline leans heavily into comedy rather than serious commentary, as he ends up putting the group of billionaires through an unusual diet at one point during the episode, leaving them feeling unwell, while Homer, seemingly unconcerned about their discomfort, insists they continue following his instructions anyway. This detail flips the usual power dynamic the show often uses when placing an ordinary Springfield character next to an extremely wealthy business figure. Rather than Homer being taken advantage of by a billionaire looking to profit off him, for at least part of this storyline, it is Homer who ends up controlling and even mildly tormenting a group of billionaires desperate for something they believe only he can give them. Frink's history with Linz gives the episode its emotional center, built around a friendship that was clearly broken by greed many years earlier, long before the events of this particular reunion. According to details revealed through the episode, Frink and Linz had known each other since their college years, described specifically as old colleagues who once worked closely together. Rather than staying loyal to that early partnership, Linz eventually chose to take Frink's original invention and build his own massive fortune from it, leaving Frink behind without proper credit or financial reward for work that, according to the episode, directly shaped technology many real people now use every single day through their phones and smart home devices. This detail gives Linz's character a more grounded, believable kind of villainy compared to some of Springfield's more exaggerated business villains. He does not need elaborate secret plots or outlandish schemes to cause harm. He simply needed one moment, years earlier, where he chose personal profit over honesty and loyalty toward a friend who had trusted him, and built an entire fortune and lifestyle from that single decision. The episode received positive attention once it aired, with several entertainment outlets specifically praising the pairing of Bart and Frink as a fresh combination for the show to explore, given that the two characters had never previously been given an extended storyline built specifically around their relationship together. One review specifically highlighted how the episode allowed Bart to show a more thoughtful, intelligent side of his personality, working directly alongside Frink rather than simply causing his usual mischief around Springfield. Another review specifically connected the episode's tech billionaire storyline back to an earlier Simpsons episode from season 11 called The Mansion Family, in which Mr. Burns, believing he might be terminally ill, temporarily moves into a lavish lifestyle surrounded by luxury, while Homer serves him personally, drawing a direct line between an older storyline built around Burns' relationship with wealth and mortality, and this newer storyline built around an entirely new set of wealthy characters obsessing over the exact same basic fear of death, simply updated for a newer era focused specifically on technology and modern billionaire culture rather than a single aging power plant owner. A separate piece of commentary published after the episode aired specifically singled out Peter Linz as one of the most despicable characters ever voiced by Glenn Howerton across his entire acting career. A notable claim given that Howerton has spent years playing Dennis Reynolds, a character on It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, already widely known and often discussed specifically for being deeply selfish and morally troubling. This particular piece of commentary specifically pointed to Linz's treatment of the island's original inhabitants and his theft of Frink's invention as the two clearest examples of why the character stood out as such an effective and memorable villain, closing with the observation that audiences could feel some relief watching The Simpsons directly criticize the behavior of extremely wealthy tech figures, rather than simply celebrating or glamorizing that same kind of wealth and success without questioning how it was actually built. Placing Peter Linz next to Mr. Burns, the character examined earlier as one of the show's very first and longest-running examples of corporate power, reveals both similarities and clear differences between how the show approached business villains at the very start of its run, compared to how it approaches them more than 3 decades later. Burns built his power through an old-fashioned model centered entirely story around a single industrial business, a nuclear power plant supplying electricity to an entire town, giving him direct control over jobs, safety, and a basic utility every resident of Springfield depended on daily. Linz, by contrast, built his fortune through modern technology, specifically voice assistant software woven directly into personal devices millions of people already carry in their pockets or keep inside their own homes. Burns's power came from owning something physical and visible, a building filled with glowing waste barrels sitting on the edge of town. Linz's power comes from something far less visible, lines of invisible computer code running quietly inside devices people use every day without ever stopping to think about who actually created the technology responding to their voice. The two characters also differ sharply in how openly they display their own villainy. Burns rarely bothers hiding his contempt for the people around him, delivering cold, dismissive lines without much concern for how they sound to others. Linz, on the other hand, presents himself with a friendly, casual, almost relaxed tone throughout much of the episode, describing morally troubling decisions, taking someone else's invention, displacing an island's original inhabitants, hiding his ownership behind a legally confusing offshore trust, using the same easy, conversational manner someone might use while casually describing their weekend plans. This difference reflects something many real observers have noted about how modern business culture, especially inside large technology companies, often speaks using a friendly, casual, almost overly relaxed style of language, even when discussing decisions that carry serious consequences for other people. Linz never needs to raise his voice or act cruel in an obvious way to cause real harm. He simply needs to keep smiling, keep using pleasant-sounding language, and let his money and legal protections handle the rest. The episode's ending brings its central conflict to a fairly clean resolution, at least regarding the immediate relationship between Bart, Frink, and Linz. Bart initially seeks some form of revenge against Linz on Frink's behalf once he learns the full history of how Linz betrayed his friend years earlier. However, rather than the story ending with dramatic punishment or consequence specifically aimed at Linz's business empire or his enormous wealth, Frink himself ultimately steps in to stop Bart's plan, choosing forgiveness over revenge, even after everything Linz took from him years earlier. This ending detail fits a pattern the show has followed many times throughout its history when dealing with wealthy business villains. Rather than showing a company or a billionaire facing serious real-world consequences for the harm they caused, the show frequently resolves these stories on a smaller, more personal level, focusing on how individual characters choose to react and move forward, while the underlying business empire built off questionable decisions typically remains completely intact and unaffected once the credits roll. Bart and Frink closes with a final joke extending even beyond Linz's storyline, showing Frink inventing a new device specifically capable of reading the thoughts of a Komodo dragon the family encountered earlier in the episode, revealing that the dragon's thoughts are far more intelligent than anyone expected, ending with the creature proposing that it and Frink should eat Bart together. This closing gag returns the episode fully to its comedic roots, choosing an absurd, purely silly punchline, rather than ending on a heavier note tied directly to the episode's earlier commentary about billionaire culture and stolen credit. Taken as a whole, Bart and Frink shows that even after more than 3.5 decades on the air, The Simpsons continues finding new angles for examining wealth, power, and the businesses built around them, simply updating its targets to match whatever kind of business figure happens to dominate real-world headlines during any particular era the show is airing in. Where early seasons built their business villains around old-fashioned industrial power tied to factories and utility companies, this recent episode instead builds its villain around modern technology, invisible software, and the particular kind of quiet, friendly-sounding wealth often associated with the technology industry over the past 2 decades. The show's very first corporate villain and its most recently introduced tech billionaire may look and sound completely different from each other on the surface. One, an ancient, openly hostile industrialist, the other, a relaxed, smiling entrepreneur surrounded by borrowed inventions and legally complicated property arrangements. Yet placed side by side, both characters ultimately serve the exact same basic purpose the show has returned to again and again across more than 35 years of episodes, showing audiences a version of extreme wealth built on taking something valuable away from someone else, wrapped inside just enough charm, humor, or legal protection to make that theft look, at least on the surface, like nothing more than an ordinary, unremarkable part of doing business. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Springfield's relationship with big business did not end with a tech billionaire's private island reunion, nor did it begin there either. The very company broadcasting these stories to audiences every week eventually found itself changing hands entirely, closing out this look at Springfield's long-running battle with corporate power by turning back toward the studio deal that quietly made The Simpsons itself part of one of the largest media mergers in entertainment history. Section 10. From Fox property to Disney property, The Simpsons' own corporate takeover. On December 14, 2017, the Walt Disney Company announced its intention to acquire a large share of the entertainment assets owned by 21st Century Fox, the media company controlled by Rupert Murdoch and his family. The original deal, agreed to at that time, valued the purchase at $52.4 billion, structured as an all-stock arrangement, meaning Fox shareholders would receive shares of Disney stock rather than a direct cash payment in exchange for their shares of Fox. Disney also agreed to take on $23.5 billion of debt already owed by Fox as part of the overall agreement. Several major Fox-owned properties, including the Fox Broadcasting Company, the actual network responsible for airing The Simpsons every week, along with Fox News Channel, Fox Business, Fox Sports 1, Fox Sports 2, and Fox television stations, were specifically kept out of the deal, instead being spun off into a separate, newly created company that would continue operating independently under the name Fox Corporation. The deal did not move forward smoothly or quickly. In June of 2018, a separate media company, Comcast, unexpectedly entered the picture, submitting its own all-cash bid worth $65 billion to try to acquire Fox's entertainment assets instead of letting Disney's agreement move forward unchallenged. This surprise offer forced Disney to respond quickly if it wanted to keep the deal alive. Rather than letting Comcast take over the assets, Disney chose to amend its original agreement, raising its offer significantly to $71.3 billion, a combination of cash and stock that came in about 10% higher than Comcast's competing bid. Facing this higher counteroffer from Disney, Comcast ultimately chose to withdraw from the bidding entirely, clearing the way for Disney's now much larger offer to move forward as the winning deal. Rupert Murdoch responded publicly to Disney's raised offer once Comcast stepped aside, releasing a statement expressing pride in the businesses built under 21st Century Fox over the years, while also expressing confidence that combining those businesses with Disney would create even greater value for the company's shareholders going forward. Disney chairman and chief executive officer Bob Iger, who had already led Disney through earlier major acquisitions of companies, including Pixar, Marvel, and Lucasfilm in the years leading up to this deal, played a central role in negotiating the final terms with the Murdoch family throughout this process. Iger specifically pointed to the growing importance of directly reaching viewers through streaming services as one of the key reasons behind pursuing such an expensive and complicated acquisition, a detail that lined up directly with Disney's plans at the time to launch its own streaming service, which would later debut under the name Disney Plus later that same year. Completing a deal of this size required approval from government regulators in multiple countries around the world, since a merger this large had the potential to significantly reduce competition across the entire entertainment industry. The United States Department of Justice reviewed and eventually approved the deal, despite some outside concerns raised about whether combining two such large entertainment companies might violate laws designed to prevent unfair business monopolies.
Beyond the United States, regulators in the European Union, China, Brazil, and Mexico also had to review and approve the agreement before it could move forward completely, reflecting just how far-reaching Fox's international business holdings had become by that point, including major television operations in markets like India through its ownership stake in Star TV. The deal officially closed on March 20th, 2019, becoming effective at exactly 2 minutes past midnight Eastern Time. Bob Iger described the moment as an extraordinary and historic one for the company, stating that combining Disney's creative content and talent with everything Fox had built together would create what he called the leading global entertainment company, positioned to take a leading role during what he described as an especially fast-changing period for the entertainment industry as a whole. Assets that officially transferred to Disney as part of this closing included the 20th Century Fox Film and Television Studio, Fox Searchlight Pictures, Fox 2000 Pictures, Fox Family, Fox Animation, FX Productions, and National Geographic, along with an additional 30% ownership stake in the streaming service Hulu, a purchase that increased Disney's total ownership share of Hulu to 60% overall, with the remaining ownership split between Comcast, holding 30%, and AT&T's Warner Media division, holding the final 10%. The Simpsons itself was included directly among the properties changing hands as part of this enormous deal, placing a show that had spent over 3 decades broadcasting jokes about its own network's ownership squarely inside the very company it had once only imagined owning it as a passing joke. News coverage of the deal at the time specifically pointed out this detail, with one report from CNBC directly listing The Simpsons alongside other well-known properties such as Cinderella, Star Wars, and Doctor Strange, as examples of the wide range of entertainment now sitting under one single corporate roof following the merger's completion. NPR's coverage of the deal closing went a step further, directly referencing the show by name and joking that Homer Simpson probably would not become the newest member of the Avengers, a Disney-owned superhero franchise, while still acknowledging that virtually anything seemed possible now that Disney controlled both properties at once. The completed deal also carried serious real-world consequences beyond simply combining well-known entertainment brands under one company. Reports covering the merger's closing specifically noted that thousands of employees working across both companies faced likely job losses as Disney worked to eliminate duplicate positions created by combining two major film and television production operations into a single, larger organization. Some reports placed the expected number of job cuts as high as 4,000 positions, with layoffs affecting workers based in Fox's offices in Century City and Disney's offices in Burbank, both located in the greater Los Angeles area, where much of the American entertainment industry is based. Disney was reportedly still informing some senior-level Fox employees about their new roles, or lack of a continued role, within the newly combined company as late as the day immediately before the deal officially closed, showing just how quickly some of the most significant real-world effects of this merger reached the people actually working inside these companies. Regulatory approval required Disney to make certain concessions as part of finalizing the deal as well, including an agreement to sell off 22 regional sports television networks that Fox had previously owned, a requirement put in place specifically to prevent Disney, which already owned the major sports network ESPN, from gaining what regulators considered too much combined control over sports broadcasting across the country. These regional networks were eventually sold to other buyers following the deal's completion, allowing Disney to satisfy this specific regulatory condition while still keeping the much larger collection of film studios, television production companies, and international media assets that made up the bulk of the overall acquisition. Fox Corporation, the newly separated company left holding the assets that were not included in Disney's purchase, began trading publicly on the NASDAQ stock exchange on the very same day the larger deal officially closed. This newly independent Fox Corporation retained ownership of Fox News Channel, Fox Sports,
audience and the Fox Broadcasting Company itself, meaning The Simpsons continued airing on the same television network it always had, even though the studio actually producing new episodes going forward. 20th Century Fox Television now operated as a division fully owned by Disney, rather than by the Murdoch family's original media company. This split created an unusual arrangement where the show remained visible to television audiences in exactly the same place it had always aired, while the actual ownership and production responsibilities behind the scenes shifted entirely to a different company altogether. Once the merger closed, producers connected to the show addressed the change directly during public appearances, discussing what the new ownership arrangement might mean going forward. During an appearance at Disney's own D23 Expo convention following the merger, executive producers Al Jean and Matt Selman spoke about the show's future under Disney's ownership, with Selman specifically stating that Disney had shown itself to be creatively supportive of the show's team, while Jean mentioned that ideas for a possible second Simpsons movie, along with potential spin-off series built around some of the show's side characters, had already come up in conversations with the studio following the ownership change. Placed against the joke first introduced back in 1998's When You Dish Upon a Star, showing a background sign reading 20th Century Fox, a division of Walt Disney Company, the actual completed 2019 merger turned what had started as a small, easily missed background gag into something that had become literally, factually true. The show had spent decades poking fun at Fox from the inside, mocking its network's programming choices, its news coverage, and even its own billionaire chairman, all while operating as a small part of a much larger media company built and controlled by the Murdoch family. That entire relationship shifted permanently the moment Disney's $71.3 billion acquisition became official, folding one of television's longest-running examples of a show mocking its own corporate ownership directly into an entirely new, even larger entertainment company, one now responsible for deciding the future of a series that had spent over 3 decades finding new and creative ways to point out exactly how strange and complicated corporate ownership in the entertainment industry could actually be. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.